Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're still in the Gospel of John, but we're getting close to the end. We're going to be in chapter 19 today. We're going to do the whole chapter. And I just want to remind you that last week we talked about the arrest of Jesus. It was after the farewell discourse that Jesus gave that went on for, 4 or 5 chapters. And then following that, we had chapter 18, which was the arrest of Jesus. And at the end of that chapter, we see that that Pilate was questioning Jesus, and he came to the realization that Jesus was saying that he is a king, and he didn't want to crucify Jesus. He wanted to, flog him and let him go, hoping that would satisfy the people. But as it turns out, at the end of the chapter, he said, do you want me to release? The custom was to release another prisoner or the current prisoner. Jesus is the current prisoner, and there was another prisoner named Barabbas, and the custom was to release the other one, I suppose, if that's what the people wanted. And as it turns out, that's what they did want. He said, do you want me to release the King of the Jews? In chapter 39 and in chapter 40, they shouted back. It was not oh no, that's not what we want to do. They shouted back, give us Barabbas. All right. Barabbas was a robber and an insurrectionist, basically, and they chose him over a king. All right, so that brings us to chapter 19. We're going to see that this is the sentencing of Jesus. So let's get started. We'll start out, we're going to do all 42 verses of chapter 19. We're going to start out with verse 1, and we'll do, let's look at verses 1 through 3. Let me read those. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. All right. We're into the difficult, inhumane part of the Easter story. It's not Easter, but this just happens to be where we are in our study. And I've called it the Easter story for obvious reasons. The Crucifixion. So I get a little emotional, and I'm sure you get a little emotional as well. Let's just bear with each other. Yes, together. There is anger on our part. There is anger, and there is great sadness. Those are emotions for the inhumane but standard way to treat prisoners that are about to be crucified. But on the other hand, where we have this emotional sadness and anger, we also have this emotion of, it's not a joy, it's not an emotion, actually it's an inward part of us that's a joy and wonderment for what Jesus willingly did for me and for you. We talked about it last week and weeks before, that he willingly gave his life for this. So Jesus chose this. He was not thrilled with the idea of being crucified, but it's part of God's plan. We all know that it's part of his plan for the forgiveness of mankind for those who believe. So that's what we have to keep in mind. It's all right to be sad and angry because we're looking at someone we love being tortured and punished for something that he is not guilty of. All right. So we're out of the trial, and it was Barnabas chosen over Jesus by the Jews to be released. Jesus was taken to be flogged, and Luke 23:16 indicates that Pilate had Jesus flogged, hoping that that would be adequate punishment and then release him. But they were, as we already said, they were not happy with that. It's not good enough. We need to release Barabbas instead. But I want to read Luke 23, verses 15 to 18. Neither has Herod, for he has sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Talking about Jesus. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. That's what Pilate wants to do. But the whole crowd shouted, and that's not a patient, soft-spoken request. The whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." All right, so that's just some additional detail that comes from the Gospel of Luke. There were three methods of flogging. In the Greek, there's one called fistigatio, which is the lowest form of flogging, and this is probably for troublemakers, and this is probably the kind that Pilate inflicted on Jesus, hoping would be adequate. The second kind would be flagellatio, which is for troublemakers who seek a little more than who need a little more than just a warning. And then there's the big one, the verberatio, which is the most difficult one to endure. It's the most punishing, and it's the one that's used for prisoners that are ready to go through a capital sentence, which will ultimately be Jesus. He is going to have the capital punishment put on him, and he's going to be he'll be sentenced to execution by crucifixion. That's probably where he's going to end up. He's going to be flogged again. That first one, fistigatio, was the lowest form. He is not actually flogged. He is actually flogged twice. The first one is here. It's more likely a beating. If you hear the Greek was fistigatio, fistigatio. So it's more than just a tap on the shoulder. I think it's more like a beating. Okay, so verse 2 says that they made for him a crown of thorns. How nice of them, by the way, to make an adornment such as a crown for a king. It was a crown of thorns twisted together and woven. It's a crown with thorns that could exceed 12 inches in length. That's a big crown of thorns. 12 inches, that's as long as my Bible, or actually it's longer than my Bible. It would make him look like a god king with radiating beams coming from his head. And in verse 3, he's wearing a purple robe. It was what was used for him. We know that he was blindfolded. If we look at Luke 22 verses 64 to 65, we see that. Let's look at that. Luke 22 verses 64 to 65. Yes, talking about the blindfold. Verses Luke 22 verses 64 to 65. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" They blindfolded him and hit him, spun him around, hit him. "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. Okay, so he was blindfolded, enduring mocking of his title. They gave him jeers, and they humiliated him with many insults that are not even mentioned here, but you know that they were not pleasant to be listening to. They struck him in the face, and since the Roman soldiers here had control of the process, do you think they used an open hand or a fist? Keep in mind that the method of flogging was fistigatio. Sounds like something to do with the fist. And we know they spit on him. All right, so let's look at verses 4 and 5 back in John 19. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns, the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Now, if you look in the King James, it says, "Behold the man." It gives me goosebumps thinking about that. Pilate wants to release him, and he says, "Behold the man. I find it's nothing that he's guilty of. Behold the man." So that means, look at the man. We should release him. Pilate clearly wants him released. He hoped the flogging would be punishment enough. And there he stands, bleeding profusely. Don't you know he's bleeding profusely? Being slapped and hit with a fist in the face, you know he's bleeding. And Pilate says he can find no fault with him. Jesus with the purple robe and the crown of thorns, Pilate fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah 6:12 when he says, "Behold the man." All right. So let's look at verse 6. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." So Pilate needed some kind of charge related to insurrection or government overthrow. If you recall, Pilate hated the Jews, and he just put up with them because their religious leaders would keep the peace. So he has to guard against insurrection and rioting as best he can, and that's the kind of charges he's looking for if he's going to have some kind of involvement in this sentencing. Not so with the Pharisees. They relate their law to Pilate. That is blasphemy. He claimed to be the Son of God. Actually, I think I just jumped further down than I needed to be. Yeah, I got into verse 7, so you'll have to hear that again in a minute. A good beating is not enough punishment for them to be satisfied, for Jesus still breathes. He's breathing the same air that they breathe, and they can't stand it. They call for crucifixion. Pilate says he is innocent. If you want to crucify him, do it yourself. And it brings him to verse 7. In verse 7, he says, the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." So Pilate needed some kind of charge related to insurrection and government overthrow, as I just mentioned, because he puts up with the Jews because he counts on the Jewish leaders to keep the peace, so there won't be any rioting and stuff like that. But it's not so for the Pharisees. They relate their law to Pilate, which is blasphemy, which means he claimed to be God. You can almost hear Pilate's anger with the Jews and the Sanhedrin's hatred for Jesus. You can just hear it in their voice. In 1831, the Jews reminded Pilate that they do not have the right to sentence or an execution to anyone. Caiaphas has already made the charge of blasphemy, The Jews already tried to get crucifixion based on the charge, but he is a king and therefore a threat to the government. Now they're back to blasphemy. They're wanting Pilate to deal with it. So let's look at verses 8 through 10. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Wow. I say wow to that. He said in verse 8, it said that he was even more afraid now. All right, let's keep going. The issue of fear. There's something not right in Pilate's mind here with what's going on, and he's uneasy with it. He's also a superstitious man, being a Roman. They have all these Roman gods, and he's just thinking that the gods are involved with this some way, and it's making him uneasy. And there's another fear we're going to talk about in a minute. But anyway, he goes back inside to question Jesus further in verse 9, and in verse 10, Jesus will not answer Pilate's question under the threat of Pilate's power. Pilate has the power. He thinks he has the power over Jesus, and he says, "I can't believe you're being silent when I have the power to do all these things to you." But Pilate is frustrated with Jesus' lack of cooperation, and for sure he is annoyed. He's putting up with this little punk Jew who's under his control and under his rule, and he won't treat him with the kind of respect he feels like he deserves. Jesus already told Pilate that he came to testify to the truth back in chapter 18, verse 33. And if you can't accept that, then I'm just not going to say anything at all. And I want to tell you that this is in fulfillment of a prophecy back in Isaiah 53. I want to look at it because we can't look at all the prophecies because the Old Testament is loaded with them. But Isaiah 53, verse 7 says this on Jesus' silence, him standing there in the face of Pilate questioning me, he just stands there. Okay, Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed. This Isaiah 53 is a famous prophecy about Jesus' crucifixion. Now listen to this. Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. He was completely silent. He was like a lamb led to a slaughter. All right. So let's look at verse 11. Let's look at the first half of verse 11. Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Okay, this is the easy part of this verse. You only have the power my Father gave you. And I want to remind you, from Pilate's perspective, that's insolence on his part. You think you have the power over me? He said, you only have the power that my Father gave to you. And I want to remind you that if Jesus really wanted to get up in his face, he could say, I have at my disposal thousands of angels that I could call down on you. But he didn't say that. In the last half of that verse, he says, therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Now, who could that be? This is the difficult part of the verse. Who handed him over? You got three choices at least. You had Caiaphas, you had the Jews, and you had Judas. All of those guys were involved in handing him over. But the one we're probably talking about when he says the one is guilty of greater sin is probably Caiaphas. He had him, had been plotting for a trial to kill, for a time to kill Jesus. And he finally produces the charge of blasphemy, but they are all partly guilty, all three of those. Okay, but Caiaphas is probably the one they're talking about here. So let's look at verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend." This is the one that gets Pilate. This is what they shouted. "If you let this man go," when Pilate said, "I don't want to do this. He's not guilty." And they say, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." This is the clincher. Pilate still wants to release Jesus, but the Jews play the king card. And that does it. He's no friend of Pilate. All right. I'm sorry, he's no friend of Caesar's if he lets an insurrectionist go. All right, let's look at verse 13 to 19. Let me read all of those. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which is in Aramaic is Gabbatha. That's not Golgotha, it's Gabbatha. It's just another place. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. And they say, Pilate says, "Here is your king." Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." And Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And I'll bet you that it was not in a soft voice that they answered. Verse 16. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. In verse 19, Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened it to the cross, which is customary. They would nail the crime onto the cross so people passing by could see what the man was guilty of. And that sign read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Wow. Verse 14 is interesting. Another comment full of sarcasm and another takeoff on "Behold the man." He said, "Here is your king." Don't you know that in itself aggravated the Jews? Here's your king. Probably filled with sarcasm. And then in verse 15, the Jews call for crucifixion. Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king?" They are screaming it now. It sounds like malice. We've talked about malice. What a horrible word that's in the Bible if it's describing a man. It's his feelings toward another. It's hatred is what it is, hoping for the worst to come to that man. And they're screaming it out. We want him to be crucified. Then the Jews yell out a comment that is only designed to get the crucifixion done. "We have no king but Caesar." He said, "Behold your king," or the sign said, "This is your king." They said, "We have no king but Caesar." The practice and tradition is that if the governor is not a friend of Caesar, therefore an enemy, if not your friend, he's your enemy, he could be killed himself. That's so that we were talking about Caesar having some fear earlier. I talked about him being superstitious and not being at ease with this trial and sentencing. He just feels like there's something going on. So this is probably the crux of it. He's afraid now that if he's perceived to not be a friend of Caesar, they might just come get him and kill him. Okay, so if Pilate is shown not to be a supporter of the king who may be a threat to the government, he could be out. So we see we're now at verse 16. The first part of verse 16 says, finally, Pilate gives in. He hands him over to be crucified. He hands him over to be crucified. What a simple statement. Everything is so understated when you read in the Bible, particularly. It's so understated that he just says he handed him over. And so it's such a simple statement to have such a large impact on eternity for everybody that will ever live and breathe. Okay, let me read 16b through 18. This is Jesus being led to Golgotha. This is where it's getting pretty rough. 16, last part of verse 16. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which is in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. The soldiers took charge of Jesus till everything is done. They're in charge now. They're out of the hands of Pilate. They're out of the hands of the Jews, and they're in charge. So whatever goes on now is their job. Okay, the first part would be a traditional flogging. This is probably of the highest order of that I told you of those 3 different kinds of flogging. This would be the viveratio, which is the kind that's used only for capital punishment prisoners. It was the sentence that was so, it was the type of flogging that was so tough that some people just died from the flogging. Without question, Jesus is bleeding profusely, almost in shock. The Roman tradition is for a convicted criminal to carry his own cross. It's kind of like digging his own grave, if you want to put it in a vernacular of watching TV. If what you see on TV, people taken out that are about to be killed have to dig their own grave. Well, the prisoners had to carry their own cross. The part that was carried was the crossbeam. The vertical part remained at the site of where the crucifixion would occur, or where it would happen, and they would take this crossbeam and put it on the upright part that's already there. But Jesus could not do it. He couldn't carry it. It was just too heavy for the condition that he was in. The route he walked is the traditional Via Dolorosa. You've heard that. It was lined with people. Some would speak, others would jeer. I guess they just took great fun in watching somebody going to their death. At the side of the crucifixion, the convicted laid on the ground. I want you to picture this. The convicted laid on the ground with arms extended over the beam, the cross beam. He was nailed or tied. Jesus was nailed and raised up and mounted in the vertical part. Can't you imagine? Well, the Romans nailed the ankles together, forcing the feet to lay sideways on top of one another. So they were kind of crossed and then nailed through both of them at the same time. It was done in such a way that there would be no tearing away. When he's nailed on there and then attached to the beam, it's slammed down in this hole. And so don't you know there's a jarring effect when that hits the bottom of the hole, and he's put up there in such a way that he's not going to be torn away. The key thing to remember about crucifixion is that the nailing is not the means of death on the cross. That's just the manner he's going to be held on the cross. Death comes from hemorrhaging, asphyxia, suffocation, and shock. It's a terrible way to die. He was crucified between two criminals, described by the same word for Barabbas, terrorist. All right, let's look at verse 19 and 20. 19 through 22. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So here's the crime. He's the King of the Jews for all the world to see. Many of the Jews read the sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in three languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, for the various different kinds of people that were going to be there. They could all read it and see as they were passing by. This must be some kind of pastime just to walk through the execution area. I don't know. I'm just that makes it sound that way. There's so many people there that they put the sign up there of his crime. So nevertheless, it said that he was King of the Jews. The chief priest of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews. This is the aggravation. The way Pilate chose to write this was in such a way that supports what Jesus said. I'm King of the Jews, or what people said, he's King of the Jews. And the Pharisees didn't like I guess it was the chief priests, they're the bad guys, really bad guys. And they didn't want it to be written that way. They wanted to say he said he was King of the Jews. So verse 22, Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. I'm not changing it, basically. I put it up there. That's the way it is. I'm not changing. If you don't like it, live with it. In verse 23, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, I'm making Pilate sound like such a good guy. He didn't want any part of this. But he finally gave it. He's not a good guy. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. All right, this is the only valuable thing that he was wearing. It was a nice piece of clothing, and it was probably made. It was actually one of the parts of the law that was specified. I think I wrote the reference to it here somewhere, but it was specified to be woven as one piece rather than weaving two different pieces together. Okay, so this is one piece, top to bottom. So that brings us to, and did it say, have we gotten to that? Yeah, okay, so let's look at verse 23 and 24. Well, I think I covered verse 23. Then verse 24 said, let's not tear it. They said to one another, let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, they divided my garments among them and cast my lots for my garment. That's back in Psalm 22, verse 18. So that's what the soldiers did. So it was traditional for the soldiers to gamble for such things. It's probably 4 guards, 4 shares, one for each. The undergarment, the tunic, was special. It was one piece with no seams. It had value. It did not want to cut it, so they cast lots for it. They gambled for it. All of this is prophesied in Psalm 22, verse 18. You should read Psalm 22, verse 18 sometime. It's a picture of crucifixion. Long before crucifixion was the standard way the Romans chose centuries later. For the Jew, it has value because, it was Deuteronomy 22:11 is where that was specified, because it was seamless. It ensures that the garment does not consist of two fabrics. I guess if there were two fabrics, the seam could come loose and it would separate, and then you just have two smaller tunics. I wonder if Jesus' mother might have made that for him. I'm guessing that she probably did. Nevertheless, it brings us to verse 25 through 30. Let me read verse 25 to 27. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother. Now listen to this. It's been a while since I read this, and it's kind of interesting to listen to this. Verse 25 through 27. Verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother. What was his mother's name? Mary. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, Mary, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. That's at least, let's see, at least three women named Mary. When Jesus saw this, saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved, which is John, that's the way John always referred to himself, standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, he says, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her, Jesus' mother, into his home. Okay, so they were near the cross, and we've got the faithful, and they were all women except one. There was Mother Mary, there was Mary's sister, there was Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, and John. Mary's sister may be the mother of James and John, making them cousins to Jesus. She may be the mother of James and Joseph. That's it from a list in Matthew 27 and 50, verse 56. And it may explain why the mother of James and John, the sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, why she was expecting some special favors from Jesus back in Matthew 20, verses 20 and 21. I think that had to do with who's the greatest in the kingdom. But nevertheless, now with Joseph out of the picture, his earthly father, now with Joseph out of the picture, his brothers had deserted him. There was nobody left to care for his mother. So he turns to Mary and to John. John is to take care of her as his mother, and that would definitely make sense if they were cousins. All right. Verse 28. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." Jesus had been sent into the world by the Father to accomplish certain things. The cross is the portion of that work. He cries out in thirst, not in desperation for life, but in fulfillment to Scripture, though I am sure he is dehydrated and thirsty. Okay, verse 29, a jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. Now, hyssop, you may ask what that is, and we're kind of saying, well, it's a plant, but we're just kind of saying that's just kind of a minor part of the story. But for the Jew, it's a significant part of the story. From Mark 15:23, Jesus had already refused a narcotic, the narcotic of wine. Now the soldiers give him a wine vinegar soaked sponge from the hyssop stalk. The hyssop plant, and here it is, the hyssop plant was used to brush the lamb's blood on the doorpost of the Israelite homes on the first Passover, when the angel of death was going to pass over. If you recall, that was the last plague that Moses pronounced on, from God, that Moses pronounced on Pharaoh. The first of every family would die unless they had the lamb's blood on their doorpost, signifying their faith in God. This use of hyssop is a direct link to Jesus with the Passover. That links Jesus with the Passover. All right, let's look at, that's a big deal for the Jew. I mean, it's a big deal for us to know and to understand some of the nuances of these things that are written in the Bible. They're there for a reason, and that's one of them. All right, so it's a big deal. Verse 30 says this: when he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. I'm thinking, well, let me keep going here. In taking the wine, he said, I do not know if it was a loud cry from one last rush of adrenaline, or if it was a hushed murmur from complete exhaustion. It's hard to know. It's hard to think that he would really have the strength to cry out in a loud voice. He doesn't say he cried out in a loud voice, I don't believe. He said, how understated, like I've said. He was probably exhausted, and he said, "It is finished." Now, that's another little nuance that we need to think about. There are very few things in the Bible that are perfect. This is one of them. He says it is finished. What he is saying is, it is finished, meaning there is nothing left to be done. It's his work on the cross. There is nothing left to be done. It is finished. There's another one. If we go back to Genesis 2, I want you to see how all this ties together. Genesis 2, verses 1 and 2. Listen to this. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. In verse 2 it says, by the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, that is creation. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Because of it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. It is finished, it said there in verse 2. It is finished. It is perfect. There is nothing left to be done. There's another one, verse 40, verse 13. This is the last one I want to show you because it's so amazing to see how the various words of the Bible have such meaning and how they all tie together. Verse 40, Exodus 40, verse 33, I believe it was. I hope it is. That's where I'm going. I don't see where I wrote it down. Yeah, there it is. Exodus 40, verse 43. Moses has been given, he was given the whole law on Mount Sinai, and part of it was the specifications for how to build the tabernacle. And here's what it says in verse 40, verse 33. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle, an altar, and put up the curtains at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. There was nothing left to be done. God specified how to do it. Moses did it and had it done, and then it was finished. It was perfect. There was nothing left to be done. Jesus said, it is finished. There's more to it than just he's dead now. It is finished. It was specified what he was to do for the future of mankind in eternity. And it was perfect. There is nothing left to be done. And he bowed up his head and gave up his spirit. That's what it said. He died. It is finished. Nothing else happened. He gave up the Greek, meaning handed over to a successor. The word is paradidomi. Nowhere in Greek literature is this word used in connection with death. This is it right here. It could be, probably is, the Holy Spirit that he's passing it over to. That doesn't actually happen until on into Acts, I believe, but nevertheless, he is passing it over to the Holy Spirit. He gave his life for the world, and he gives it up willingly. So let's go to verse 31. Yeah, he died on the cross. I want to go back. I want to just keep reminding you of this. I know you don't forget it. It's impossible for a Christian to forget this kind of detail. Jesus knew this was coming. He spoke to the disciples all along about it, and they never understood what he was talking about, but he knew this was coming. It's been referred to as hour or his cup, and it's finally here. He knew it was coming. He could have done anything he wanted to do to get out of it, but he didn't. It was God's will for him to do this, and Jesus was perfect. Jesus was obedient to God's will. His will aligned with God's every time, and he was always obedient to God's will. That's what made him sinless. Okay, let's look at verses 31 to 33. Let me read all of those. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. I believe it said over there's a preparation for Passover. The next day was to be a special Sabbath because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other man on the other side of Jesus. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs. So most likely this was the preparation day for Passover. And it was a special time because it was a special Sabbath because it was the time of Passover. The Jews asked Pilate to break the legs on the cross so that they would die quicker if they weren't already dead, so they could get them down off the cross and be done with it because of this special Passover that's coming up. So they broke the legs of the first man, then they broke the legs of the second man. But when they got to Jesus, they found that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. And that was also in fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus would never have a broken bone. And they just wanted to increase the shock and the shame of the way he died, but he was already dead. So they didn't have to do that. And in verse 34, it says, to make sure he was dead, they pierced his side. Blood and water rushed out of his side with a sudden flow. Doctors have tried to figure this out, but the one that makes the most sense is that it is a buildup of blood and water from flogging and crucifixion, which can be almost 2 liters, like a half a gallon. That's enough to cause a sudden flow. If there's a hole put in your body, it would just rush out. After the Passover lamb had to be without blemish, no broken bones would make Jesus a perfect sacrifice. He's in fulfillment of the law. He came to fulfill it, and this is part of it. He was a perfect sacrifice. So with Jesus, a living sacrifice, a genuine life, whose life had been given, not taken. All right, let's look at verse 35 to 37. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. Verse 36, these things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of the bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they had pierced. You can go back to Zechariah 14, I think it is, or Zechariah 12, when Jesus, it's a prophecy of Jesus returning to earth, and the Jews see the wounds and the piercings, so that they knew that they had crucified their Messiah. That's what it's talking about. Okay, verse 35 to 37. So it's what I just read. The testimony of the events came from John. He's an eyewitness to it. He saw it, and it's evidence for the truth. It was seen and reported. The interesting point about verse 35 is that John is not passing around a story that he heard. Who wants to hear it secondhand if you can't depend on the guy that started the story? Well, he was an eyewitness. He has seen and reported the account of an event for him he saw for himself. Then he reports the fulfillment of two prophecies that we have taken. I think I just talked about that, Zechariah 12:10, to remind us that these events in Jesus' life have been prophesied. Okay, so it brings us to verse 38 through 42, which is the burial of Jesus. Let me read 38 and 39. Later, Joseph, now there's some interesting facts in here, which we've talked about before, but later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. In verse 39, he was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Wow. Joseph asked Pilate for Jesus' body, and Pilate gave it to him. Joseph was wealthy. We know that from Matthew. We're not going to read these scriptures, but he was a wealthy man from Matthew 27, verse 51. He was a member of the Sanhedrin from Mark 15:43. He was a resident of Jerusalem, so that's why he had a tomb there. It was one he was planning on using for himself. And he was a secret disciple. This is so amazing. We get this feeling that there was nobody that stuck with Jesus here at the end. They've all deserted him. But we find that's not true. Joseph was a secret disciple, and he's the one that asked for the body. And he was a good and upright man, and he did not argue with the Sanhedrin as Jesus was crucified. That's in Luke 23:51. He was a secret disciple, but Scripture says that he also that he loved the praise of men more than praise from God. But I'm pretty sure that the secret part gets taken off his back when he takes Jesus's body, he's no longer a secret disciple anymore. They're going to know. And then it mentions Nicodemus was there to help him. Nicodemus was the one that Jesus talked to when Nicodemus came to him at night. He's the one that Jesus said to him, you must be born again if you want to be, for salvation, to be saved. And there was a big discussion about all that, but apparently Nicodemus accepted it. There's a question as to whether he accepted it or not at the time, but now we know that sometime later, Nicodemus became a follower, and he was, I'm sure, a secret follower as well, but no longer after what he and Joseph of Arimathea did. They're not secret believers anymore. Okay, verse 40 and 41. This will be our completion of our study. Verse 40 and 41, well, actually, almost the completion. Beginning verse 40, at the place, taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. That's just the way they did it. And then in verse 41, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Okay, Nicodemus brought 75 pounds of funeral spices. The act of an incredible amount for one funeral, 75 pounds. Was a sign. It was a sign of Jesus' the honor for Jesus. Remember, Mary Magdalene, when she anointed Jesus, she used a very extravagant perfume. This is another sign of extravagance because it was a way to honor him. And the tomb was carved in limestone. It had a rolling stone. Let me read the details to you of how this shakes out in the past, the way things worked. It had a rolling stone, 6 feet tall, very heavy. It was in a track, so it could be rolled somewhat easily, but I'm sure it wasn't that easy to do. It was designed to be reopened to put decomposed bone into boxes. Remember, the woman on the way to the tomb was concerned about how they would be able to open it, but the earthquake took care of that. It had a burial chamber with a stone bench where the body was prepared. It had a burial niches where the body was laid, and there were bone boxes called ossuaries. So they would go back after the bodies decomposed, and put them in ossuaries, and they were kept in the tomb. This was a new tomb, though, that was never used, so there were no ossuaries in there. There was no burial that had ever been performed there before. All right, so verse 42, let me read this. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.